All right, guys, so on this project, after you do your butt joint and have it rounded and you have it sanded and your ring and your band is ready to go, this is when you can start adding that other component that you need to solder to the top, okay? And this type of solder seam is not called a butt joint, where you take the two edges and heat them up. This one's actually called a sweat solder seam. So a sweat solder seam, think of it as being two planes getting smashed together like a PB&J, and the solder's on the inside, all right? So anytime you're doing something like that, most likely it will require a sweat solder seam, okay? So the first step to sweat soldering is figuring out where you want to solder it. Since there's a seam right here, what kind of solder is this? Do you remember? Hard, medium, easy? Hard solder. Because we're learning, we're going to solder away from that because we don't want to melt that again, all right? So we're going to keep that in the back of our ring as if we were wearing it and it was in the back. I'm going to solder something to the top, all right? So the way that you have to do that is there's a couple different ways you can set it up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up in a way that is like this, and then the ring sits on top of it like that, okay? Now how are you going to do that? Have you guys been wondering what these are for? Yeah? This is called a third arm. It acts as a third arm, but it's not made of skin, and it won't get burned, right? So it will hold things in place for you, okay? So when you're sweat soldering, the setup is very, very important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out how I can use this to set up my ring to how I want it to be. Here's the seam. I want the seam to be away from that, and then eventually I'm going to solder it like so. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. And I don't have to touch it anymore. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you're sweat soldering though, you need something to sandwich together. And what that requires is a two-step process. So, first step is to always flux it. Flux does what again? Uh-oh. What does flux do? Why am I putting this on here? It helps the solder flow, but how? What's it actually doing? What's its function?
To not make it fall.
Oh boy. It keeps the metal clean, you guys. Remember? Mm-hmm. Keeps the metal clean. Okay, so if I have a solder seam on here that's hard solder, what kind of solder should I use for this one then? Medium, right? So I'm going to put a couple pieces of medium on here. And I'm going to use it, think about a dice, right? You're rolling a dice. When we were doing a butt joint, we were making like a dotted line like a road. Now think about it like a dice. For how much space this is occupying and how much contact these two pieces are going to make, I'm thinking I'm only going to need about 2 pieces of solder. Everybody's is a little bit different, but and it also depends on how big the pieces are. So I might put 3 on here. Yeah, I'm going to put 3 on here, okay? And I'm going to set it up like that. Now, you're going to notice this isn't even close to soldering yet. I'm not soldering that right now. This is why it's called a sweat solder seam. I'm going to sweat this solder onto this piece of metal first. And then I'm going to heat it up again so that it flows onto this. I know. Let's just watch. So this is really important because you need to make sure you don't flood it. What's going to happen is I'm going to let this bubble, and it's just going to start to melt. So it's going to be like a little ball, like a little puddle of a ball on like a, I don't know, kind of like a snowball starting to melt. Okay? That's what you're looking for. So I'm going to put it on kind of low, and those are going to move around, right? But that's not a big deal because I'm just going to get a solder pick, and I'm just going to wait for that flux to go clear. Once that flux goes clear, then I can move my solder to where I want it to be. Okay? Now, this is going to get hot really fast because this is a little piece of metal, right? I'm going to kind of put it in the middle here. I don't want that to be all over the place. So now I'm just going to kind of, you got to pay very close attention now. Did you see it just kind of puddle?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my metal stayed pretty clean where I need to solder it. You see how it's still copper colored? That's because of the flux, all right? I can then go ahead, quench this in water, all right? It is clean enough. This is clean enough to solder this to that. However, if it got black and it didn't solder right away and it didn't melt, you would have to go and put it in the pickle for a couple minutes and then come back to this step, okay? This is clean enough. And then I just dried off on my clothes. Don't do that with yours. Okay, so now I'm gonna set this up. This is very important. I've soldered this already. Is there still flux on this, or did I burn it off? I burned it off. So I need to apply more flux to this. If I don't, this will not work. Add flux again. Then put flux where you're going to solder it to the ring. Okay? That's where the PB&J comes from, okay? You gotta put it on both sides. And I'm gonna try to melt this again. So now, this adjusts in all these different ways. See that? So once you get it to how you want it, should I make it like that? Or should I make it like that? Maybe like this? Okay. So I'm gonna kind of sit it like that. I'm gonna make sure it's even, I'm gonna make sure it's ready to go. And now I'm gonna heat it up. Now this is challenging because I'm gonna use one step up larger one. I have to heat up the entire piece to be the same. This is where it gets difficult. So it's already soldered to that bottom piece. So it might require me to heat up my ring just a little bit more than that bottom piece, okay? I also want you guys to notice that if you're laying something flat on this brick sucks out the heat from your metal. So a bottom piece would require more heat on it. Does that make sense? So most of the time, you sweat the solder to the bottom piece first. And we'll go over sweat soldering again. This is just a little seam. And once you see it flow, did you see it flow?
No.
There's a little tiny line of solder that you can see. And I'll show it to you. The way you can really tell is that when you put it in the water, it doesn't fall off, right?
Yes.
But what you're looking for is to see the solder line come to the edge. Can you see it, Juan? See that little white line? You see it? Little white line? Okay. Now, this might be hot, guys. Don't do that. That's hot right now because obviously it heated up, okay? So you might have to wait a minute. I kind of get impatient and I kind of go like this. Sometimes it will open. Or you can just wait a few minutes for it to cool down. I don't have a lot of feelings in my hands, so be careful. This is hot, so we're gonna put it on the hot plate, right? So people don't touch that right away. It needs a couple minutes to cool down. Copper tongs, quench it in the water. Voila. Okay? Ooh, and it's soldered. So I'm gonna put this in the pickle. You don't need a ton of solder because if you have a ton of solder, guess what you have to do to it? You have to file it and clean it up. Okay. So, is everybody okay? You ready to learn the second part? Okay. I'm also going to do a sweat solder seam with these two pieces of metal. Now, I'm going to fold this up to be a ring eventually, but it's way easier to solder something flat than to solder two rings within one another. Okay? There's all different ways to do something. I find this to be the easiest for a simple ring like this. So, this is the bottom piece, right? I'm going to sweat solder metal, that piece of metal first. So, if this is my first solder seam on this ring, what kind of solder should I use? Hard. Very good. I should use hard solder. And I'm going to put it right in the middle, and I'm going to do it like a dotted line. It's going to be a really skinny PB&J. The goal is to not make it flood everywhere, but sometimes it's hard not to do that when we're learning. So I'm going to space this out a little bit wider than what I told you guys to do with your butt joint seam. Whoops. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm just gonna sweat this. You can stop videotaping this one because it's really embarrassing.